The trees began screaming on the morning humanity finally learned to listen. Not in sound, not in any frequency the old instruments would have caught. The screaming came in chemistry, in syntax, in the electrochemical pulse of a language so ancient it predated oxygen itself. And Dr. Yara Osei, standing alone in the Congolian rainforest with a neurolattice array pressed against the bark of a tantus-enrolled Moabi tree, heard every word of it for the first time. She wished, in the marrow of her bones, that she had not. This is Transmission Log 7 Omicron, archived by the Xenolinguistics Division of the United Earth Science Collective. Timestamp, year 2247, Cycle 4. What follows is a full account of the first contact event, not with a species from the stars, but with one that had been beneath our feet for 600 million years. Listener discretion is advised. What you are about to hear cannot be unheard. To understand the year 2247, you must understand what was lost and what was desperately being rebuilt. The cascade events of the 22nd century had rewritten the map of the living world. The Amazon, once the lungs of civilization, exhaled its last sovereign breath in 2119. The boreal forests of Siberia ignited in a chain reaction that burned for 11 years. Coral systems collapsed in a quiet, bleaching genocide that no one televised because the cameras had already moved on to the wars. But humanity, as it always had, adapted. By 2200, the Great Reforestation Initiative had seeded 23 billion engineered trees across the scarred continents. These were not ordinary trees. They were threaded with biolatus filaments, synthetic root networks grown from a fusion of mycorrhizal fungi and carbon nanotube mesh that allowed ecological data to flow between organisms at near-network speeds. Scientists called it the Verdant Web. They thought they had built it. They had not understood, until Yara Osei, that they had merely knocked on a door that was already, impossibly, open. The Verdant Web was never just a tool. It was an ear. Humanity, in its frantic attempt to resurrect the biosphere, had inadvertently built a receiver capable of translating the language of the oldest civilization on Earth, and the oldest civilization on Earth had been waiting with the patience of geological time for someone to finally tune in. Dr. Yara Osei was 43 years old and carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 decades fighting a war with no clear enemy. Her left arm, from the elbow down, was a precision-fabricated prosthetic of bone-white ceramic and copper-trace nerve wire, a souvenir from a biosphere survey drone accident over Lake Victoria in 2229. She barely noticed it anymore except on cold mornings, when the ceramic contracted slightly and her fingers ached with phantom warmth. She had not come to the Congo for glory. She had come because of an anomaly in the Verdant Web's signal architecture, a recursive loop in the chemical data stream that her monitoring algorithms flagged as not random, noise that repeated, noise that rhymed. It was the kind of pattern that a lesser scientist might have dismissed as a calibration artifact. Yara had spent 16 years cataloging the chemical vocabularies of restored ecosystems. She knew what calibration artifacts looked like. This was not one of them. Her neurolattice array, a crown of hair-thin sensors woven through a surgical mesh headband, translated electrochemical signals from the biolatus filaments into something the human nervous system could approximate as sensation. Most researchers used it to feel temperature gradients, moisture flows, root pressure maps. Yara had spent 3 years reprogramming hers to go deeper, to attempt something no peer review board had approved and no ethics committee had sanctioned, to listen not just to the data of the forest but to the intent behind it. The inciting incident was almost embarrassingly quiet. It was 5:47 in the morning. The forest was a cathedral of mist and birdsong. Yara pressed her palm to the Morbi's root shoulder, that massive, buttressed arch of living wood that spread across the forest floor like the base of a cathedral column, and activated her array at maximum sensitivity. For 2 minutes she felt the usual wash of biological commerce, the slow nitrogen-rich conversations between mycorrhizal nodes, the chemical distress calls of seedlings being shaded out, the deep osmotic murmur of water moving upward through xylem channels 100 meters overhead. Beautiful, complex, alive, but familiar. Then something changed. The signal did not grow louder, it grew organized. Beneath the biological noise, like a voice speaking from the bottom of a very deep well, something began to construct a sentence, not in pheromones or terpenes, not in the chemistry of survival, but in something that her array translated as pure, concentrated meaning. Her visual cortex received it as light, and her auditory cortex received it as resonance, and her limbic system received it as grief so profound it nearly drove her to her knees. The first transmission was for words. Her array rendered them in English because that was the language of her cognitive baseline, but she understood immediately that the word shapes were a translation of something far older, far slower, far more vast. Transmission received. We remember you, Yara. Sat down very hard on the forest floor. Her ceramic hand left a perfect, bloodless print in the mud. For 6 minutes she confirmed this later from her array's timestamp log. She did not move, did not breathe in any meaningful sense, did not process anything except those 4 translated words and the bottomless, geological weight of the emotion that accompanied them. They remembered her, not her specifically. Humanity, the species that had walked among them, cut them, burned them, replanted them, named them, painted them, buried its dead beneath them, eaten their fruit, built its cities from their bones. That species, they remembered it the way a canyon remembers a river, the way stone remembers fire. They had been watching, processing, waiting, and now, through the accidental miracle of the Verdant Web, they finally had a channel narrow enough for human comprehension to receive what they had, for 600 million years, been trying to say. The report Yara filed with the Science Collective was classified within 6 hours and suppressed within 12. This was not, as she initially assumed, malice. It was panic. Director Emre Tunker, the Xenolinguistics division, a precise man who wore his augmented reality contact lenses like armor, and had not experienced an unplanned emotion in what felt like decades, reviewed her transmission logs and then spent 40 minutes alone in his office with the lights off. Because if Yara was right and the data was immaculate, and she was always right, then humanity had not committed ecological crimes against a passive, insensate backdrop. It had committed them against a civilization, against a consciousness distributed across 200,000 species and 4 billion individual organisms, and a root network so dense and so complex that its processing capacity, modeled conservatively, exceeded the combined computational output of every data center humanity had ever built. They had not been burning forests, they had been burning libraries. They had been burning minds. Tunk's antagonism to disclosure was not, in the end, ideological, it was existential arithmetic. He ran the numbers as he always ran the numbers, and the numbers said the same thing in every model. If the public learned the truth, the social cohesion required to complete the Great Reforestation Initiative would collapse under the weight of collective guilt. The mission would fail. The biosphere recovery would stall. And the civilization they were trying to feed and sustain would fracture not in decades, but in years. He was not wrong. He was also not right. And in the space between those two truths, the real crisis was gestating. While Tunk suppressed the report and convened his emergency committee and ran his models, the Verdant Web kept transmitting. It did not care about classification levels. It had waited 600 million years, and it had not run out of patience yet, but it had. The data made clear, developed something new. The transmissions were no longer just remembrances, they were warnings. Yara translated them from her field station, working without sleep, fueled by bitter coffee and the particular feverish clarity of someone who has discovered something so important that rest becomes physically impossible. The messages came in cascading pulses, nodes of the Verdant Web, lighting up in sequence across continents, like synapses firing in a brain the size of the planet. Each transmission carried the same core signal, elaborated and deepened by each successive node. The pruning is complete. The new roots hold. The network remembers what was lost, but the burners return. The same pattern, the same forgetting. We have seen this before. We cannot wait again. The burners. Yara's translation algorithm flagged the word as approximate. The chemical concept was far older, and more layered than the English verb could carry, but the meaning was precise enough. The trees had identified a faction within the reforestation movement. Corporations and governments that were planting trees in visible, photogenic locations while continuing to clear-cut primary forest in jurisdictions without satellite coverage. The Verdant Web knew. The root networks stretched under every border. There were no jurisdictions in the language of Mycelium, and the phrase that detonated in Yara's chest like a depth charge, "We cannot wait again." 600 million years of patience, and the oldest civilization on Earth had finally reached the end of it. What the trees were proposing, and Yara spent 4 days refusing to translate it correctly because her mind kept presenting her with the clinical horror of it, was not violence. That was the thing that broke her. It would have been easier if it were violence. What they proposed was a withdrawal of consent. The global biolatus network, the Verdant Web that humanity had built in its race to survive, was, he now understood, also biological in a far more profound sense than the engineers had intended. The mycorrhizal component wasn't just a passive conductor. It was alive, networked, coordinated. And if the civilization that ran it decided, collectively and deliberately, to begin routing its chemical outputs away from the crops and orchards and urban green spaces that fed 8 billion human beings, the result would not be immediate, it would not be dramatic, it would be slow and precise, and total. Harvests would fail, not from drought, not from disease, from silence, from the forest simply deciding that it was done giving to those who kept taking. Yara transmitted Tunk's name into the root network. She had learned by then how to ask questions through the array, how to structure a query in the chemical grammar of the forest. She asked whether they knew that not all humans were the burners. She asked whether they understood that the ones who built the Verdant Web had done so out of love, out of grief, out of the desperate need to repair what their ancestors had broken. The response came in under 2 minutes fast, by the geological standards of her earlier conversations, and loaded with an emotion her array translated as something between sorrow and precision. We know, we have always known. The grief is real. The love is real. IT is not enough. You cannot love a thing and also sell IT. You cannot grieve a thing and also burn IT. Your species contains both. IT has always contained both. We are asking which one you will choose to be. She was crying before the transmission finished rendering, not because the message was cruel, because it was so extraordinarily, precisely correct. The trees had watched humanity for 60 million years since the first primates climbed into their canopies. They had seen the whole arc of it, the reverence and the chainsaw, the sacred grove and the lumberyard, the indigenous elder who asked the tree's permission and the industrial executive, who asked only the tree's timber yield. They had held both things simultaneously and been ground between them, and now they were done being ground. They were asking humanity to resolve its own contradiction, not for the tree's sake, but because the trees already knew the outcome of every future in which it didn't.